Alright, y'all, so we are back here for chapter 2. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and load the PowerPoint. And let's make myself small. Alright, so chapter 2, y'all, Britain and its colonies. In your new book, it's probably called something a little different, I'm not sure. Maybe England and its colonies. Yeah, it's called England's colonies. But it's all the same stuff. Okay, so Britain and its colonies. Here we are looking at chapter 2. Okay, so let's look at it, y'all. Early on, it was obvious that the English had different styles than the Spanish. They sought to bring over their plantation style of life that they had used in Ireland. The Spanish controlled all aspects of life, but the English focused less on religion and more on personal matters. So the English are going to focus. I told you this at the end of, towards the end of the chapter 1 video. That like Spain really cared about people's personal life, like cared about everything, religion, the total life. The Dutch cared about it the least. The French were next to the Spanish, and the British were next to the Dutch. Like the British care about what's going to give them the best result, kind of. Okay. Another thing is that the British's New World was very different than Spain's. There were no huge groups like the Aztecs and the Incas, only smaller groups that were more spread out. England also stayed along the coast. Okay, so when we talked about the Spanish, y'all, they encountered these huge civilizations of the Inca, the Aztec, the Maya, all in Central and South America. Well, remember when we talked about the different types of tribes, the regional tribes? The British are going to encounter that eastern woodland, all typically 2,000 people or less in a village. It's not like the Aztecs that had 200,000, right? So it's a very different new world that they're encountering. Also, the British are almost always going to stay along the coast. They're trying to stay as close to the coast as possible. Whereas the Spanish, they traveled all over into the interior, up in whether it's North America, South America. They went all over the place. Okay, so those things are a little different. Let's keep that in mind. Now, when we talk about, and I guess I should have had that. I thought I had that on a different slide. But again, the British are going to bring in their plantation system. They're not focused on all aspects of society. Their new world was a different kind of new world than what the Spanish encountered. Okay, so first we look at the Chesapeake colonies. Okay, Chesapeake Bay, Chesapeake region, think around Virginia, Maryland, that sort of area. Okay, so England first got involved with the New World in the late 15th century, so late 1400s, when John Cabot was looking for a northwest passage. He was in the Newfoundland area, giving England a future claim to that area. Remember, the French are up there around Canada, doing a lot of stuff in Canada, but here's this English guy claiming Newfoundland, so it's a big deal there. Anyway, John Cabot was looking for a northwest passage. He was in Newfoundland area, giving England a future claim there. However, he does not create a permanent settlement. Then in 1583, the English try again. So much later, 1583, the English try again, but Sir Humphrey Gilbert failed as well. He got no permanent settlement because he died at sea. So what's the point of all this, y'all? What I'm telling you this, whether it's John Cabot or whether it is Sir Humphrey Gilbert, England doesn't like sit back and just wait forever. They're trying, they're just not getting permanent settlements. Okay. Next, we get Sir Walter Raleigh, who tries along the coast of North Carolina at a place called Roanoke Island. Okay, so don't think Roanoke, Virginia, think Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. He tries at a place called Roanoke Island in 1587. He leaves John White in charge. This trip also included women and children, and we get the birth of the first first American-born English child. And what we see there is her name's going to be Virginia Day. It was a girl. So we had women and children that came on this trip that settled Roanoke Island, and ultimately, women and children there. We get a birth, the birth of Virginia Day, and she was the first English-born child in North America. So the first English person to be born in North America. But what we see is that John White is going to leave the colony to go and get supplies. He's going to leave Roanoke Island and go back to England to get more supplies. But he was delayed because of the war drama with Spain and the whole Armada ordeal. So right about the time he's going back to England, is when what we talked about in chapter 1, where Philip II of Spain sends his whole armada to like invade England. So that delays John White from coming back. Okay, so he was delayed with the whole armada deal, and it took White 3 years to return. Hey y'all, I'm gonna go for some milk. 3 years later, he's finally coming back. Okay, so he left to get supplies. It got delayed because of the Spanish Armada invasion and all that. Finally makes it back 3 years later, but he finds only the word Croatoan carved into a tree. It was the name of a nearby island. They explore, but they find nothing. Y'all, there's been a lot of research, a lot of recent publicity about Roanoke Island. There's different theories and different things, and a lot of that stuff's out new in the world. But the reality is that the evidence is very sparse on what happened to these people. Obviously, something happened to them, but what exactly happened is a bit debated. Again, there are people who look and say, oh, okay, well, they must have mixed into this local tribe. That's a very plausible idea, but there's also people who say, oh, no, they probably got wiped out by a storm. Regardless, y'all, that colony did not persist, okay? So, finally in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I dies. She was the queen that Philip II had all the problems with, right? Okay, so finally in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I dies, and James I becomes king. He's the first Stuart king, S-T-U-A-R-T. And what I mean by that is, if you hear people talk about the Tudor Stuart lineage, long story short, like Queen Elizabeth was a Tudor, James I is a Stuart, so like it's like their cousin, like they're of the same family, but they're not direct descendant type things. So anyway, Queen Elizabeth dies, James I becomes king. He's the first Stuart king. At the same time, joint stock companies emerge. People share the burden of expenses, and they share the profits. Only the extremely rich and kings could afford to finance these ventures alone. So what we're seeing is, y'all, think about what it would cost to send a whole crew out across an ocean with enough supplies, enough material, to where they could make it there, and if there was a problem, even make it back and not die of starvation. All the tools that you would need, all the food you would need, all those different things, right? So imagine, like, I'd go out on a limb and say some of you have probably been on cruises, some of you probably haven't. So some of you are saying, yeah, I could afford to go on a cruise, and some of you are like, I can't afford to go on a cruise. Well, how many of us could have paid for the entire cruise ship? Like, pay for the entire cruise ship. Only the very rich can afford that, right? By the way, if any of you can afford that, please let me know. I'd love to become better friends with you. That's a bad joke. But anyway, what I'm getting at here, y'all, is only the extremely rich could afford to finance these things. So we start to see joint stock companies emerge, where, I got $17.37 in my account, you got $17.53 in your account, but if we put all of our money, if everybody in class puts up our money together, maybe then we could afford to start this business, start this venture, start this adventure, if you will, in going into the new world. And whenever when the colony starts to make money, then we all make money, right? We share in the profits. A joint stock company. We're jointly sharing the cost. We're jointly going to share the profit. Okay? So Queen Elizabeth died. James I comes in. He's the first Stuart king. We see joint stock companies coming about. All these different things are here. Okay? So that brings us to Virginia. And I know I've talked about Walter Riley and John White and Croatoan all under Virginia, but we're really getting into Virginia proper here with Jamestown. Okay? Excuse me. The London Company was a big joint stock group that organizes an expedition. And in 1607, they create the first permanent settlement, and they called it Virginia, after Elizabeth I. Why do they name it Virginia if her name was Elizabeth? Well, y'all, Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. What do you mean she was the Virgin Queen? Well, she never got married, so obviously she was a virgin, right? Well, that was how they saw it, right? So, y'all, Elizabeth was queen. The reason why the name changes, like I told you, from Tudor to Stuart, is because Queen Elizabeth never got married, so she never had a direct heir to the throne. Whether or not she was a virgin or not, that's another subject, right? But she was known as a Virgin Queen because she never got married, so whatever. Okay. But when she dies, it goes to a family relative. It goes to James the First. He's the first Stuart king. Yada yada yada. Okay, so they name the colony Virginia after Queen Elizabeth I, and they settled the town of Jamestown. Okay, so they brought 3 ships with about 100 people, and they settled along the Chesapeake Bay. They took a river that they called the James River and settled the town of Jamestown. Okay, so Virginia became the entire colony, but they settled along the James River at a place called Jamestown. Those who came, though, were upper-class second sons. They didn't have a whole lot of work ethic. They came to find riches and not be laborers. So they go through some bad times, and by the winter of 1608, only half are still alive. Okay. What we're seeing here, y'all, is that there was this thing back in Europe, kind of referenced by the term primogeniture, which basically means the oldest son gets everything. So like when parents would pass away, everything, their entire value, was inherited by the eldest son. It wasn't split up. Everything was given to the eldest son. What happens if they have 2 or 3 sons? Those 2 or 3 sons have lived in, if the parents were wealthy, had lived in wealth, had become accustomed to certain things. Well, now it's up to their brother. And will their brother be nice to them or whatever? Well, a lot of these people who grew up in nice family homes didn't want to go out and be workers. So they came over to the New World. They hear of all the gold and all the riches that the Spanish are finding, and they want to be a part of that. So they come over on this get-rich-quick scheme. They're going to come over, find gold, go back home, and everything's going to be good, right? Well, their New World is different than what the Spanish encountered, right? So they come over, they have to do a whole lot of work. None of them want to work. They have really poor work ethic. Again, they came to find riches, not be laborers, and they go through some bad times. And by the winter of 1608, only half of them are still alive. But then John Smith comes to the rescue. He takes control and says, quote, no work, no food. He throws that line out there, right? No work, no food. If you're not going to participate in helping, you're not going to get any food. So if you want to eat, if you want to survive, you better start working. So they started the London Company, or they started the expedition in 1607. They create that first permanent settlement of Jamestown. But by the winter of 1608, things are looking pretty bleak. John Smith comes in, says no work, no food, and everybody starts to pitch in. However, problems arise again in Jamestown, because Jamestown is in the middle of what's known as the Powhatan Confederacy. Okay, if you're looking on PowerPoint right there, it looks like Powhatan. I've heard Powhatan. I've heard Powhatan. Typically, I say Powhatan. Okay, so Jamestown is in the middle of the Powhatan Confederacy, which was 30 tribes united under Chief Powhatan. There were many disputes between the natives and the Europeans until John Rolfe marries Pocahontas. Okay, now why does that matter? Why does it matter, y'all? And this is where Disney kind of gets it wrong, right? Disney tells you Pocahontas married John Smith or something. No, it was John Rolfe. Okay? So many disputes were there between the natives and the Europeans until John Rolfe marries Pocahontas. The reason why that's a big deal is because Pocahontas was Powhatan's daughter. Okay? So now we see the chief's daughter, the chief of this confederacy, not just of one tribe, but the chief, in essence, of 30 tribes, marrying one of these Europeans. That becomes a big deal. That's the bridge that helps settle things. So ultimately, she also converts to Christianity and takes the name of Rebecca. I'm sure she ordered pumpkin spice lattes and was your typical whatever, right? I'm joking, okay? I'm joking. Whatever. But hopefully you get my point. So she, in some ways, really embraced the Europeans, but in other ways really didn't. Sometimes there was a trip where she made it back, or she went to Europe, and she was kind of put on display, and it was this really, really awkward thing for her. So she wasn't this person who was fully in love with the European culture and wanted to go back to it, but at the same time she was integral into helping end, or at least subside, some of the conflicts between the Powhatan Confederacy and the people of Jamestown. So, so I'm just trying to look at things. Now, war, disease, and insufficient food supplies always left the settlers in hard times. Okay, war, disease, and insufficient food supplies left the settlers always in hard times, needing more people and supplies. I mean, who want, like, if you're not going out there to look for gold, and if as soon as you hear that there's really not big stockpiles of gold like the Spanish found, why are you going to go out there, right? So not a lot of people are going out there. It's really touch and go. But in 1612, John Rolfe began his experiments with tobacco, finding and experimenting with different variations of the plant. Finally, in 1616, he has a good product, and the English colonies now have an identity and a means of creating return on investment. Y'all, why did all of those people back in 1607, almost 10 years earlier, decide to give up their money and pay for people to travel across the ocean? Because they were expecting to make money somehow. They didn't find gold, they didn't find other riches. Eventually, John Rolfe comes to the rescue again by experimenting with tobacco and finding a good product. Now, what can happen? Remember, tobacco was new to the Europeans. It was very much a native thing. It was very much an American thing. So now they have this tobacco. Now they can sell this tobacco back in Europe, and what? The people of Virginia, the people of Jamestown, can make a ton of money and get rich. So ultimately what we see happening here is that now the British colonies are going to start to get an identity. They come over, they are here. These Chesapeake colonies are going to be really focused on making tobacco because that's how they're going to make their money. Okay? So now we get the headright system. Anyone who could transport himself or bought a share in the company could have 50 acres and 50 more for his servants. So, it's this really interesting thing, the headright system. How do they get more people to come over and farm more tobacco so that they can make more money? Well, they say, well, if you buy a share in the company, or if you can pay your own way to the New World, we'll give you 50 acres of land. You bring servants, we'll give you 50 more, right? So all these people who come over and can start farming, now people are going to start to come into Jamestown. Now people are going to start to come into the Virginia colony and farm tobacco and make money. Okay. So what it does is it really gives the, excuse me, I hit my desk there. It really gives the British colonies an identity of what are we here. The Spanish were over there doing what? They were converting Native Americans. They were forcing Christianity on. They were bringing in their encomienda system. They're searching for cities of gold and all this stuff. The British, what are they doing now? They're focused on making tobacco and making money off of it. Okay. Now, we also get a turning point in American history, y'all. Here we get in the year 1619. 1619. We get freedom and slavery. If I ask you to give me two defining characteristics of America that are almost polar opposites, those might be the two words you pick up, right? Things that have defined and been critical to development of the United States of America have been the concept of freedom and the issue of slavery, right? In essence, both of them arrived in the or what would become the modern United States in the same year, in the year 1619, okay? In 1619, we get freedom and slavery. How do we get the freedom? The settlers get, quote, the rights of Englishmen with a general assembly known as the House of Burgesses, which was a representative government. So, the people in Virginia started petitioning, and they're trying to get better representation and yada yada yada, and they're fighting to have an establishment of some sort of government in their colony. And so they create the House of Burgesses. Think like any other legislative body, like Student Government Association or Congress or the state legislature, anything like that. They're creating something like that. They're creating the House of Burgesses. Okay? So now they are claiming that they get the rights of Englishmen, and they are entitled to certain things, and so on. Okay? So that's where we get the idea of freedom. These people who are now looking to govern themselves. Okay? Then, with that, also in the year 1619, we see slavery. Okay? Yes, we had saw the Spanish bring in slaves as early as 1503 into South America, maybe even parts of Central America. But here in what would become the United States, we see something for the first time in the year 1619. A Dutch ship dropped off approximately 20 Africans. These are the first Africans known to be brought to English America. That's a big thing here, y'all. English America, not just America in general, but English America, because, again, when we start to look at where the United States kind of is born from, it's going to come from British America. Now, again, in chapter 1 video, I talked about how much the Spanish legacy, how lasting and deep of an impact that leaves on America or on the United States. But remember, the British are in essence the country that we will declare our independence from, so their influence is vastly important as well. So a Dutch ship dropped off approximately 20 Africans. These are the first Africans known to be brought into English America, and not all were slaves, but their later roles would be critical to that development. What I mean by that, y'all, is that these 20 Africans, and I think the actual number is like 19, but we'll just round it up, call it 20, right? These 20 Africans are not slaves when they're brought over, okay? They may have been servants, they may have been something else, but by a definition of a slave, they were not. But what happens to these 20 people and what happens to Africans as we move forward is going to be critical into the development of what we know as African American slavery here in the United States. Okay, so that moves us on to Maryland. So again, y'all, 1619, pretty big turning point in American history as we look at both the idea of the House of Burgesses bringing in a concept of freedom, and that Dutch ship dropping off about 20 Africans. It brings in the first notion of any sort of concept of slavery into British America. Now, as I was saying, let's look at Maryland. Maryland was founded in 1634 as a royal colony. It was not a joint stock, but a proprietary colony. A proprietary colony is a colony granted to one person. So it's a royal proprietary colony. What that means is that it's a royal colony. The king or queen granted the entire colony to one person. So proprietary means it was given to one person. Royal colony meaning that the king chose a person and said, boom, hey, you go out and this is yours. Or the queen. Okay, so it was not joint stock, but a proprietary colony, one granted to one person. Lord Baltimore, think about it, Baltimore, Maryland. Lord Baltimore established it as a haven for persecuted Catholics. He settled the city of St. Mary's near the Potomac and gave land to Catholic gentlemen. But he also brought Protestants as servants. Okay? So Maryland was set up as a safe haven, as a place for Catholics. Now remember that, y'all. England at this time is ruled by who? England is ruled by Protestants. And if you're not familiar, if I'm confusing you there, or when I talked about some of this stuff in the chapter 1 video, understand this. For the longest time, there was one Christian church, largely. There's a thing called the Eastern Orthodox, but in the West, like in Europe, there was one Christian church. It's a Catholic church. And eventually we go through some stuff where the Catholic Church splits up into what we call the Protestant religions, and then the Catholic religion. So you had Catholics, then you had Protestants, and within Protestants, you had all of these different groups like Baptist, Methodist, Anglican, Presbyterian, right, Calvinist, all that different stuff. Okay, so you have that. So England is ruled by some people who are not Catholic. So Maryland gets set up by Lord Baltimore as a place for persecuted Catholics, as a safe place. Okay, so he established it as a haven for persecuted Catholics. He settled at St. Mary's near the Potomac and gave land to Catholic gentlemen, but also brought Protestants as servants. Maryland was a land of religious freedom for all, not just Catholics. That's going to lead to some problems later on. So it's a place that's supposed to be a safe place for Catholics, but we'll let everybody else in. Well, you could easily see how that might lead to problems. Like, this is going to be a safe space for you, but we're going to let all these people who don't like you and you don't like them, we're going to let them in too. Right? Like, that kind of seems like it might be a little odd. Okay? Now, Lord Baltimore ruled as governor and had a 2-house legislature. And he could give out really big estates. He could give out big chunks of land. But he also had to give out small ones too. Why? He could give out large ones, but why did he also have to give out small ones? Simply put, y'all, more people. If I have 100 acres of land and I give 2 guys 50 acres each, well, how many people am I eventually bringing into this land? Not many. But if I give 2 people 20-acre tracts, okay, well, that's 2 families that I've brought in. And then there's still, 60 acres left? If I give 5 acres to other people, whoa, hey, now that's bringing in more people, right? Another way to think about it is, think about desks in class. Where can I fit more of? One of your little rolly desks that we have in class, or little individual desks, or a big 4-person table, right? So if I give a bunch of tables, I can't fit as many people as if I had all those individual desks. That's kind of thought. Small farms brought in more people. Many farms went to tobacco, so therefore Maryland had a similar economy to Virginia. Okay, so he could give out large estates again. Lord Baltimore had total control. He was the governor. He had a 2-house legislature, and he could give out big estates, but he had to give out small ones too. Okay. Now, life in the Chesapeake. What was life like in the Chesapeake? Okay. Indian problems, Native American problems never go away. As more people come in, they need more land. Where do they go? They encroach on Native American land. That causes problems, and we'll get things like Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. Now, what I want to show you here is I'm going to do, just because it's the easiest thing for me to do, I'm going to pull up good old-fashioned paint. Okay. So, laugh at what you will. I'm just going to let y'all know, y'all, I am an incredible artist. Okay. A lot of what I'm going to show you in this class when I have to draw something is just absolutely incredible art. That's a bad joke. I'm horrible. But I'll give you an example. Anytime you see me draw, like the United States, when I draw the nation, what am I going to do? I'm going to do this. That's the United States. And that looks like a really bad oval. But you get my point. So instead of me trying to actually draw the United States, I just do this. Now what happens when we look at this? Where were the British settling? What did I tell you they did? So they settled all along the coast. So they come in right here. And then a few years later, more people come in, so they go there. And then they keep going out, right? And that's some really bad drawing. But you kind of get my drift, okay? So that was the idea. So let me do it a different way. So we have the coastline, right? Well, what happens, again, first people came in and they settled this area. Then the next wave of people came in and settled this area. And then came in and settled this area. Now what's the problem? Who already lived in this area before the Europeans moved in? Native Americans, right? So every time Europeans move further and further out, who are they getting into problems with? Who are they causing trouble with? The Native Americans, who keep getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, right? Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. I'll minimize that. So, what we see happening here, y'all, Bacon's Rebellion, we see a guy by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, who kind of led this. We see some unhappy lower class people. Oh, actually, I should have left that up. Okay, and here's the reason why. Y'all, where do you think the rich people lived? Right here. Where did the poor people live? Out here. So what happened is that these people brought in servants. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I'm looking for something. Give me just a second. Okay, so one thing I'll mention right quick here. I think I might say it somewhere else, but for the time being, I'll just say it now so I don't miss it. One of the things we got to pay attention to is that I mentioned you could have 50 acres more under that headright system. You got 50 acres if you made your way out there or you bought share in the company. And you got 50 more if you brought servants, right? Well, one of the things is that they started bringing over these servants. They needed people to farm this land. Well, the way it works is that indentured servitude, and I know I'll talk about this later, but I don't want to confuse you too much. So I'll explain a little bit here. Indentured servitude, you came over and you worked for an agreed time frame, like typically 4 to 7 years. I brought you over, you worked for me for 4 to 7 years. Think about it. You couldn't afford that cruise across. You couldn't afford to move over. So I paid for you to come over, but now you got to work off that debt. So you work for me for an agreed term of, say, 5 years. Well, after that 5 years is up, you're no longer my servant. You get to move out and do your own thing. And I was kind of responsible for helping you get set up. Well, and if I was a rich person who lived here and got you over here, am I going to set you up in this good, top-notch land? No, it's probably all taken. And if it's not all taken, I can't afford to, I'm not going to spend the money to get you set up here. Where am I going to get you set up at? I'm going to get you set up on the edge of town, right? And so eventually we keep moving further and further out. So these are the rich people, these are the next, and then the next, and the next. And the further out we go, the poor people typically were, okay? So keep that in mind. Nathaniel Bacon led some unhappy lower class people. William Berkeley, okay, William Berkeley, I don't have his name up there. William Berkeley was the governor of Virginia, and he and his upper class friends were not paying taxes. And they had a trade with the same natives that were causing problems in the West, okay? So Governor Berkeley and all his rich friends live here in this first section, okay? Let's do this. That's not doing what I want to do. I don't know why that's not working, but anyway. Berkeley and his friends all live there in that first section, right? So, oh, well, I guess that would have worked. They all live here in this first section. That's where all the rich people are living over here in the red, right? Well, the poor people living out here are pretty perturbed about what's going on because they are fighting with who? The Native Americans that are out here, right? So you got your poor people living here fighting with the Native Americans while these Native Americans are trading with the rich people over here, right? So when we look at all that, the people stuck here in the middle are not happy about any of this, okay? Well, when we pay attention to all of that, what we see is that these people, the poor people, are going to get unhappy. I was trying to fix that, y'all, and it was just bothering me. Because I know some of you are going to be like me and want to see the whole thing in red, right? And some of you are going to, it's really going to bother you if I just leave that little spot not done. It's going to really bother some of you. So I'm going to do it just to mess with you. Anyway. Yeah, what I'm getting at is that the poor people, okay, so our poor people who are living here are paying taxes to help the entire city. These rich people are not paying taxes, and they're doing business with the Native Americans. Well, the Native Americans are constantly, these groups are constantly fighting. So you see how this is becoming a big issue that's really going to set up, okay? So, anyway, William Berkeley, the governor of Virginia's upper-class friends were not paying taxes, and they had a trade with the same natives that were causing problems in the West, aka if this is the East, this is the West, right? So then Bacon goes to Berkeley seeking protection, but is denied. So Bacon starts to defend himself. So like the poor people went to the rich and were like, hey, help us fight back these Native Americans. So now we have fighting between the lower class and the natives. Then Berkeley asked the House of Burgesses to build forts. Okay, let's build a bunch of little forts. We could build something right here, and right here, and right here, and to protect all the people, all the poor people live out here. Okay? But the Western settlers don't like this. Well, why wouldn't they like this? Why on earth wouldn't they just complained about the help and now they're getting it. Okay? Settlers don't like it because how do you pay for all of these forts? Taxes. Who pays taxes? The poor people, like Bacon. Who doesn't pay taxes? The rich people, like Berkeley. So now we have fighting between the lower class and the natives. Then Berkeley asks the House of Burgesses to build forts in the West, but the Western settlers don't like it because of the increase in taxes. Now they rebel and march on Jamestown. They burn it. They light the city on fire. Berkeley escaped, and Bacon died soon after this. So the rebellion really fizzles out. Y'all, this is super important. Bacon's rebellion is super important. And here's the reason why. Who was, in the rich people's mind, who was causing all the problems? The settlers over here. The people they eventually helped get over here. These poor servants who, once they worked off their term, were settling over here. So what does that tell the rich? What does that tell the rich people over here they need to do? Stop bringing in servants that are only servants for a little while. Start bringing slaves that are slaves for a lifetime. Okay? So what we see is that soon after that fire, Bacon died, the rebellion fizzles out. This worried the rich Eastern planners, so they begin to look at buying slaves instead of bringing over servants. Okay? So hopefully my incredible paint art there helped explain some of this to you. Okay? So next thing, y'all, we look at the Caribbean influence on the slave trade. Caribbean influence brought both slaves and sugarcane. Sugarcane was very labor intensive. This meant that a lot of slaves were needed. So what we see is that the Caribbean influence on America here in the Chesapeake, at least early on, is twofold: bringing in slaves, but also bringing in sugarcane. Sugarcane's a very labor-intensive crop. Y'all drive around where we're getting ready to hit harvest season of sugarcane, aka what a lot of locals call grinding, right? Or grinding. And so look at how much work is involved in that. And imagine, again, what it's like if we didn't have the modern technology we do with all of the mechanical equipment. So sugarcane was very labor intensive. This meant that a lot of slaves were needed. This created a huge population difference between whites and blacks, even getting to the point in the Caribbean of seeing 4 slaves to 1 white settler. So what's that mean? This leads to the Barbados Slave Code, or as was often referred to, just simply the slave codes. Okay, so with so many more slaves than white settlers, this leads to the Barbados Slave Code. That will also immigrate to the Americas, where enslavers, like the master, you'll hear me use those terms too. A lot of times I won't use the term, or sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. But when I try to think about it, a lot of times I'm using the term enslaved for slaves, or enslaver for the master, right? Or you can't, or the owner, right? You'll get those terminologies. So that the idea of the slave code also came to the Americas, where the enslavers had total and complete control, and the enslaved had no rights whatsoever. Okay? Now, during this time, we also see the triangle trade. Triangle trade was set up where you had the first leg is going to be from Europe to Africa, and let me do this. Let me pull up the map again. So the first phase of this would be from Europe to Africa. The middle stretch, or the middle passage as it became known, was from Africa to the Americas, wherever it was, and then the third leg was from the Americas back to Europe. It worked as this: the people in Europe would take a finished good, would take a good, a product, something that was a final product, and they would sell it to the people in Africa, or trade it to the people in Africa for slaves. Then they would take those slaves and ship them over to the Americas and trade them for raw materials. Those raw materials would then be brought back to Europe to be turned into a finished good or product. Okay, so that's the triangle trade. In the middle passage, that trip from Africa to the Americas was harsh. It was about 2 months long, small spaces, rampant diseases. Some of the slaves went on hunger strikes, but this often failed. Y'all, during the time of what we look at as far as the Atlantic or African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade saw about 12 million people transported. Y'all think about that. Like, just to kind of put this in context for you. The student population here on Nichols campus is about 6,500, maybe 7,000 if we really push the numbers, right? We're talking 12 million people over the course of this Atlantic slave trade. 12 million people were transported. That's an incredible number when we look at this, y'all, and it was extremely harsh. And a lot of people are going to sit back and say, well, if you had all these slaves on slave ships, because y'all, they are packed in there like sardines. If you've never seen this stuff before, and I don't know why my computer is acting up on this, but if you've never seen pictures of slave ships, people are absolutely packed in there in a horrible fashion. Disease running rampant, like they didn't have proper facilities for whether it was medical or just simple sanitation, what happens when these people get seasick and they're in closed, cramped quarters, right? Y'all, most of you have been to our class, right? And we're socially distanced in our class with 30 people in there. If we were under normal conditions, we'd have about 60 people in that class, right? Imagine that same classroom, if you've been in there, having like 200 people. That's what it would have been like, or at least more comparable to that. Okay, for 2 months packed in, and you only get brought up to the top deck to get air every couple days, and they feed you slop. And you say, well, why didn't they rebel? Okay, y'all, sometimes it's just not that simple. Think about it. A lot of times what happened with slavery is that the people over here on the coast, they traded. They got slaves from the interior part of Africa, right? They got slaves from the interior part of Africa, brought them to the coast, traded them with the Europeans, and those interior Africans were transported over here, right? So if you try to overtake the ship over here on the west coast, or on the coast of Africa, and try to get back, you probably just be enslaved again, right? If you waited till you're out in the middle of the ocean, do you know where to go? Do you know how to operate any of the limited technology they had as far as navigation? Then if you waited till you were within sight of here, you look completely different than the people who are here, so they're expecting you to be a slave anyway, right? So there aren't a ton of good options. They did go on hunger strikes, but it wasn't a whole lot, okay? Now I'll go back to this. The Stonewall Rebellion. Slaves often used very subtle means of expressing their discontent. And I'll talk about this repeatedly throughout the semester. But just to kind of put it in context, y'all, again, you don't see a lot of big rebellions on these slave ships because what are your options? Slaves often use subtle means of expressing discontent. Faking sick was a big one. Rarely did they fully and outrightly rebel. One example, though, of a big rebellion or a revolt was the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina. And y'all, this is stepping forward. I'm just giving you an example of one of the times when they did rebel. About 15 slaves began marching to Florida, where the Spanish governor agreed to free them. Along the way, they killed about 20 to 25 settlers, but they were quickly shut down. Again, y'all, so there's basically been one successful slave revolt when we look at the idea of the Atlantic slave trade. There's been one successful slave revolt, and it was a part of a larger independence movement. It wasn't just a slave revolt, it was a slave revolt that turned into an independence movement. So, slave revolts oftentimes aren't super successful. So, when you say, well, why didn't they do something? Sometimes it's a lot more difficult than you realize, and you got to remember, enslavers made it a point to not let those things happen, to do everything they could to keep them from happening. Okay, so that kind of gives us our Chesapeake colonies. And again, I'll go back to the map. Let me see if it'll come in. So when we talk about, we're talking about England and its colonies, we're going to talk about the 13 original colonies, right? So we're looking everything along this eastern seaboard, basically. So first we look at our Virginia colony, our Chesapeake colony. So we got Chesapeake Bay in and around here. So we got Maryland and Virginia, right? All of that region. That's our Chesapeake. Now we're going to move up and look at New England. So we're going to talk about Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, this region. This is going to be our New England colonies, okay? So, let's look at it. North of the Chesapeake, we get very different colonies. We get very different people. Remember, our Chesapeake saw a lot of elite second class, our upper class second sons. In New England, we see very different people. They were middle class who paid their way and had very few servants. Therefore, there was no real big elite class. Virginia, Maryland, we start to see some real stratification, right? Some super elite, some super rich, and some super poor. New England, we're going to see a lot of middle class people coming over. So, there was no real big elite class. We see many fishermen, seamen, and farmers. They had a better life expectancy because of the colder weather. They had a better life expectancy because of the colder weather. It reduced the spread of disease. Think about it. You go into a hospital, it's cold. Why? Because cold reduces the spread of disease. So a better life expectancy because it's colder climate reduced the spread of disease. but they also had less good soil. They had less arable soil. So what's that mean? They can't farm as much. Okay, so the South, better climate, better condition for farming, but the North had a better climate for reducing disease. So let's talk about these colonies. First, we look at Plymouth. Puritanism is big in early New England. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church and remove the links to Catholicism. Okay, so what we see is that these are the people we're going to talk about as, like, you remember those pilgrims and things like that when you learned in elementary school when you were drawing turkeys with your hand, right? That sort of stuff. Okay, so when we look at this, what's happening here is that you had the Puritans. The Puritans were these people who were Protestants. But not only did they want to separate themselves from the Catholic Church, they thought the English Church, that what became known as the Anglican Church, that wasn't even good enough. They needed to purify the Anglican Church and completely separate themselves from the Catholic Church. Like, the way I'll explain it, and y'all, this is not meant to belittle or denigrate or to downgrade anybody, but the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church are pretty similar. Like, you could almost look at it like Coke and Diet Coke, right? Like, there's, and that might even be about it. It's like some people would just say one was. You get my point, okay? So the Anglican Church wasn't radically different from the Catholic Church. Well, you have these Puritans who say, no, we need to come in and purify. Well, separatists were like ultra, super, uber Puritans. We're like, no, we need to completely separate and get everything away from anything that looks like the Catholic Church. Okay? So, they come in. Again, they wanted to purify the Anglican Church and remove all the links to Catholicism. Again, separatists were like super, uber, ultra Puritans. They lived in England, but they sought a new place. First they went to Holland. First they went to the Netherlands and stuff like that. So first they went to Holland, but failed. And then they came to the U.S. on the Mayflower. They wanted to land in Virginia, but they missed. So they were not in a colony at first. So they created the Mayflower Compact, right? Like, they wanted to land in Virginia, but they missed. They landed in Plymouth. Well, because they landed in a place that didn't have a colony, that didn't have a government, to them it was like landing on an abandoned island, on a deserted island, right? They created their own government, which they called the Mayflower Compact. This is significant because it's an early step in the American tradition of consensual self-government. You will hear me say that a lot throughout this semester. Consensual self-government. It is a big theme we will explore at least until we get to the American Revolution. This idea of consensual self-government. And what's that mean? What consensual self-government means is that people are consenting. We are agreeing to govern ourselves. The Mayflower Compact is not important because it lasted for hundreds of years. It's important because it was the first step. It was a baby step in the idea of Americans governing themselves. The idea of consensual, us collectively agree, consenting to govern ourselves. That's what made it super important. Okay? So, they wanted to land in Virginia but missed. They were not in a colony at first, so they created the Mayflower Compact. It was significant because it's an early step in the American tradition of consensual self-government. But it was quickly outgrown. Like, they quickly outgrew this idea of the Mayflower Compact. Okay? So, that brings us to Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay, what would eventually become known as just simply Massachusetts, absorbed Plymouth in a short time, as it had an established form of government. So once the people arrive in Massachusetts with an actual legitimate government, Plymouth just kind of merges into them. Like, if you've ever wondered why, like, there wasn't the state of Plymouth, like we had the 13 colonies, but where the heck, and Plymouth was founded, but where's the state of Plymouth, right? Well, this is what happens. Plymouth gets wrapped up into Massachusetts because it has a legitimate, established form of government according to the people back in England. So anyway, Plymouth was absorbed, or Massachusetts Bay absorbed Plymouth in a short time as it had an established form of government. Massachusetts Bay also started with Puritan influences. So again, we see that Puritan theme come into play here in Massachusetts. So no surprise, Plymouth gets wrapped up with it. Now, John Winthrop sought to use the colony as a free place for persecuted Puritans. So John Winthrop, again, sought to use the colony as a free place for persecuted Puritans. Winthrop was a lawyer and noticed a big opportunity. Y'all, what do we pay lawyers for? Loopholes. We often pay lawyers to find the loophole, find the way to get us out of something, right? Winthrop's a lawyer. He found a big loophole. He noticed that the charter is like the legal document. Think about a charter. When I say the word charter, think like Constitution, the founding document, right? The charter for Massachusetts Bay said nothing about keeping office in England. Therefore, they took the charter with them to help keep the government local. Okay, y'all, I guess think about it like this. If your articles of incorporation, if you're a business, or your charter as a place, or your constitution, the founding documents of your organization are in a place thousands of miles away, are you really in control? Are the people back in that office in control? Well, their charter said nothing about keeping an office. Most of these other colonies had to have an office, had to have some sort of boss back in England, not Massachusetts Bay. John Winthrop caught on to that. So he brought the charter with him to keep the government local. On the voyage over, Winthrop spoke of creating, quote, a city upon a hill, a shining light for all the world to use as a model. He wanted to create this perfect city, this wonderful city that would be a city upon a hill, the shining light for all the world. He wanted to create this perfect example. So since they brought the government with them, they were the law. John Winthrop and his free landowning friends held power tightly, but soon realized they needed to bring others in. But they restricted it to church members. So at first, John Winthrop and his free landowning friends, like the few elite people that we would see in Massachusetts Bay, they held all the power. Well, then they realized, okay, we need more people involved. But you can only be in charge of anything if you're a member of the church. If you're not a member of our Puritan church, you don't get to vote. You don't get to do anything, right? Like, you can't have any position of power. So it's John Winthrop and his free landowning friends. Then they let a few more people in, but those people are church members, good church people, right? If you're not a part of our church, you can't do any of it. Okay, so he and his free landowning friends held power tightly, but soon realized they needed to bring others in. But they restricted it to church members. Okay, the church always remained involved, and we get major problems with the witch trials. Now, we're not talking Salem witch trials yet. Okay, that's going to be later on. But the church always remained involved, and we get major problems with some witch trials. We see this woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson. She is a very outspoken woman, which that was not normal. Women were not outspoken at this time. And when throughout life, anytime we see something that we don't think is normal, how do we treat it? Oh, if it's not normal, it's not good. That's bad. That's bad. That's not normal. You shouldn't be doing that, right? A lot of times we treat things that are not normal as not good. Okay? So she was a very outspoken woman. That's not normal, which is not good. She said she spoke directly with God. That's blasphemy to these people. So what do you think they did to her? And if you're thinking they killed her, man, y'all were crazy. Like, they're not that mean. They just banished her from the city, and she was eventually killed by Native Americans. They didn't kill her, they just banished her, right? It's okay. It's not our fault she got killed. She's the one who said she talked to God. But anyway, y'all, she said she spoke directly with God, which they called blasphemy. Ultimately, she's going to be banished and killed by Native Americans. But that brings us to another person, okay? Roger Williams. And I know you see his name under Rhode Island, but we got to talk about him in Massachusetts Bay first. So Roger Williams. Roger Williams was an important man. He was a minister and what they called a visible saint. Like, he was an example on earth of what you should do, what you should be like. He was they called him a visible saint. A person who was a shining example of how you should act, right? So, he's an important person, minister, and visible saint, so well-respected person. But he has some ideas, and his ideas cause a lot of friction. He wanted separation of church and state. He said that, like, your voting shouldn't be impacted by whether or not you're a member of the church, and the church shouldn't control everything. He wanted a separation of church and state. He also said there should be no universal tax on all people from one church. So understand this, y'all. You had Winthrop and his friends. Then you had those people who were church members, and then you had the people below who weren't church members, right? Well, everybody paid taxes, and some of that tax money went to the church. So even if you weren't a member of the Puritan Church, say you were a Catholic, but you lived in Massachusetts, you paid taxes, and some of your taxes went to the Puritan Church. So Winthrop says Roger Williams says that's not right. We should have a separation of church and state. He didn't want a universal tax on all for one church. He also wanted to pay the natives for the land. He thought that they should get something. For all of that, he was banished. So Roger Williams is also going to be banished, but he's going to be successful in other ways, and we'll pick up with that in the next video, y'all. I'm going to do chapter 2 here in 2 different videos, so this will be the end of part 1. Okay, so this is the end of chapter 2, part 1. I'll see y'all for the next one.